No one on Flight 782 paid attention to the quiet janitor sitting in row 10, seat B. He looked like a man life had pushed around too many times, eyes tired, shoulders heavy, hands scarred with old burns from mops, buckets, and double shifts. But when the captain's trembling voice suddenly crackled through the speakers asking, "Is there any combat pilot on board?" everyone turned to the front of the plane. No one turned to look at the forgotten single dad in the middle row. No one imagined that the man who could save them, who once soared through war-torn skies, was right there, head bowed, silently praying he'd never have to fly again. Row 10 was never meant for heroes, and Daniel Carter certainly didn't feel like one anymore. He used to be Captain Carter of the U.S. Air Force, a combat pilot with over 100 missions logged in dust-choked valleys and moonlit skies. But now he was just Dan, the janitor at Ridgeview Elementary, the man who mopped floors before dawn and after midnight to ensure his 9-year-old daughter, Ellie, never felt the weight of how little they had. He sat on the flight with his cap pulled low, clutching the fraying strap of his old backpack. He wasn't traveling for business or holidays. He was traveling because Ellie had earned a place at a regional robotics competition with her homemade solar robot, and he had promised he'd get her there, no matter what extra shifts it took. She had fallen asleep against his arm, small fingers curled around his, trusting him fully in a way that broke him and healed him at the same time. Around him, passengers buzzed, someone complained about the seat spacing, another tapped impatiently on their screen because the Wi-Fi wouldn't connect. A teenager 2 rows ahead laughed loudly at a joke on his phone. No one noticed Dan checking the exits, calculating angles out of habit, the reflex of a pilot who had spent years landing under fire. But he forced those instincts down. That life was over. The sky had taken too much, his friends, his confidence, and eventually even his wings. When Ellie stirred and whispered, "Daddy, are we almost there?" he smiled gently. "Soon, Peanut. You're gonna do great. I'm proud of you already." It was moments like that which kept him going. But then, 20 minutes after takeoff, the plane lurched violently. Drinks spilled, oxygen masks shook, a collective gasp swept the cabin. Ellie's small hand tightened around his wrist. "Daddy, what's happening?" He stayed calm. He always stayed calm, he had been trained to. But he felt something deeper this time, a dread that crawled into his bones. The intercom buzzed, crackled, then went silent. A minute passed. Then another. Something was wrong, very wrong. Finally the captain's strained voice returned, shaky in a way no pilot allowed themselves to sound unless it was dire. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a critical systems malfunction. I repeat, a critical malfunction." People gasped. Someone began to cry. Luggage bins rattled like loose teeth. The captain inhaled sharply, then said the words no one ever wants to hear on board a commercial flight. "Is there any combat pilot on board? If so, please come to the cockpit immediately." A stunned silence fell over the plane. Passengers turned and scanned every row, searching for someone who looked like a military aviator. Someone strong. Someone confident. Someone in uniform. No one looked at the thin, exhausted janitor in row 10. Except Ellie. She whispered, "Daddy, that's you." And in that moment, Dan felt his heart break wide open. He had sworn he'd never fly again. He had sworn he'd never put himself, or his daughter, through that fear again. But the plane trembled beneath them like a wounded animal, and he knew that if he stayed seated, people might die. He looked at Ellie, brushed her hair back gently, and whispered, "Stay right here, Peanut. I need to help." With a deep breath that carried the weight of all his buried memories, Dan stood. And row 10, quiet, ignored row 10, became the center of the universe. When Dan stepped into the aisle, he felt dozens of eyes on him, confused, doubtful, silently questioning why this man thought he could answer the captain's call. He didn't look like a pilot. He looked like a tired father who cleaned classrooms for a living. But his steps were steady, purposeful. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had once carried lives in his hands at 20,000 feet. A flight attendant rushed toward him, panic etched on her face. "Sir, do you know what the captain asked?" Are you actually? Dan simply nodded. Take me to the cockpit. The attendant hesitated only a moment before leading him forward through the narrow aisle, past passengers who whispered, speculated, or stared with desperate hope. Some looked skeptical, but in their fear, they clung to the possibility that salvation could come from the most unexpected place. As the cockpit door opened, Dan stepped into a world he thought he had left behind forever. The panels flickered with red warnings, alarms blared in chaotic rhythm, and the captain, pale, sweating, looked up with relief so sharp it bordered on disbelief. You're the pilot? Former Air Force combat pilot, Dan confirmed quietly. What's failing? The captain gestured helplessly to the controls. Primary hydraulic failure. Backup system is compromised. We've lost steering on descent. Autopilot is unresponsive. Dan slid into the co-pilot seat, his hands trembling for just a second before muscle memory took over. The feel of the yoke, the hum of a wounded aircraft. His brain lit up with instincts he'd buried deep. His voice grew firm, commanding, the old Captain Carter resurfacing like he had never left. Okay. First, cut the left side valve. Reroute backup pressure. Bring electrical to manual override. The captain blinked. You still remember all this? Dan didn't answer. He didn't need to. For the next 10 minutes, he worked with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of a man who had once guided burning aircraft across enemy skies. Sweat trickled down his back, alarms screamed, and the altitude dropped faster than it should have. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Ellie clutched her seatbelt, whispering, Daddy, please come back. A young woman beside her tried to comfort her, saying, He'll be okay. He's doing something brave. Ellie shook her head. He's not just brave. He's the best pilot ever. Back in the cockpit, Dan realized the plane was still descending too fast. The landing gear wasn't responding. The runway was minutes away. The captain swallowed hard. We're coming in too hot. Dan's jaw tightened. Then we slow her down manually. That's impossible. Not today. With the technique he had once used to save a downed squadron member, Dan forced the aircraft into a risky aerodynamic maneuver, tilting just enough to bleed speed without stalling. The aircraft groaned in protest, rattling violently, but it responded. The runway rushed toward them. Passengers screamed. Ellie whispered, Daddy. The wheels hit the ground hard, once, twice, then skidded, sparks flying. The plane veered, tires burning against the tarmac. Dan fought the yoke with everything he had left. And then, the plane slowed. Straightened. Stopped. Silence. A long, stunned, breathless silence.